Thanks for making it out. First session in the morning after the social event. Hope everybody's not too hungover. Hope you all got some breakfast in you. So thanks for coming out. So a lot of you probably know about the changes that have been happening with Adobe in the past 6 months or so. So we have a pretty good relationship with Adobe, and we sort of got some good runway on all this stuff happening. So we used the opportunity to sort of rethink how we manage and deploy Adobe apps at Pixar. And it gave us it was a good opportunity to just sort of do a total rethink and try and use some of the ways that some of the best parts of how we were doing it before, while also sort of trying to do it the way Adobe wants us to. So, by the way, I'm Dan Berman. I work at Pixar, as you can see. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the old way that Adobe used to work. Starting with serialized licensing, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It's basically you create packages with the Creative Cloud Packager. It has your serial built into it. And it activates when you install, and you do a true-up with Adobe, usually on an annual basis, sometimes 3 years. Then there's named user licensing, which I'm sure many of you also know, where all of your users have an Adobe ID, and you assign them apps, usually using the admin console. And they have to sign in for their apps to be able to work. And then there was device licensing. Admittedly, I work in the enterprise, so I don't know a ton about the whole education side of things, but I'll give you some resources for that afterwards. So in the new world, we have named user licensing, which is pretty much the exact same as it was before. And instead of device licensing, we now have shared device licensing, which basically works as a way for educational institutions only to license lab machines. So it's still sort of a machine license, but users still sign in, students still sign in to get access to their Creative Cloud libraries and to actually have the app be licensed. And it's important to note that if you are an educational institution and you decide to migrate from device licensing to shared device licensing, you only have a 30-day window to complete that migration before all of your Adobe apps are considered. You're in the SDL world. And there's also this really weird one called feature-restricted licensing, which seems like actually not that many people know about. And as far as I know, last time I talked to Adobe, Pixar is only one of, I think, like 25 customers that are actually using it in production. And it's kind of weird. It's machine-based, so it's kind of like serial numbers, but it has a bunch of different activation methods depending on your environment. And you can't use any cloud features with it, so Premiere Rush, XD, and Creative Cloud libraries, all that stuff is no good. And Acrobat is not currently supported with it, but I've been told that is coming very soon. Okay. So shared device licensing and feature-restricted licensing, it's important to know, are only CC 2019 and above. You can't do anything legacy with those new licensing methods. Named user is pretty much the only one where you're going to be able to continually use legacy versions. And so I wanted to mention, since I'm not really in the education world very much, my knowledge of shared device licensing is somewhat limited. There are a couple of people who know a lot more about it than I do. Darren Wallace and Neil Martin. I know at least Neil is here, so find him after if you have more questions. And I'll also have links at the end of my talk. You can look at some presentations that those guys have done with some really good overviews of shared device licensing. So feature-restricted licensing is super weird. The first sort of mode of feature-restricted licensing that you can use is called connected, which is basically you can have a pre-FRL package that you make in the admin console and then deploy that, or you can deploy just a shell package that's like basically a trial version and use the Adobe licensing toolkit afterwards to activate it. And it basically just talks right to Adobe. It uses like a device ID and key handoff, and it activates that way. And that's the way we use it at Pixar. So we have this use case where we were migrating named license, but we have a lot of machines that are like in conference rooms or in story rooms, review rooms, scanning stations, those kind of things that have a lot of users coming in and out all the time, and it was just not going to make sense for people to like log in and log out every time they use the machine for 5 minutes. So that was why we set up feature-restricted licensing, and it's really good for that purpose. The second mode is called isolated, and its main use is for air-gapped workstations. By the way, if you're educational, you don't need to worry about any of this, really, because you have shared device licensing. But if you're an enterprise, yeah, and you have this sort of use case, you're probably going to want to look into FRL. So yeah, isolated is mainly meant for air-gapped workstations, and it's where you install the package on the workstation that's air-gapped, and you run Adobe Licensing Toolkit on it, and it gives you a key, and then you take that key and plug it into your admin console. It gives you a key back, and you do this sort of handshake, but the machine never has to talk to the outside world, and it activates on your air-gapped machine, and then you're good for 3 years, I think. And the last one is called LAN. This one is not even officially announced by Adobe yet, but they gave me permission to talk about this. It's basically where if your entire network is air-gapped, they will allow you to run what is essentially an on-prem license server, and that server, you do the sort of offline key handoff you get the key, and there's the device ID from the machine, and then you do the admin console key handoff, and then plug that back into your on-prem license server. And then all of your clients on your network talk to that on-prem license server, and so nothing has to talk to the outside world. As far as I know, there's only 2 or 3 customers in the world that are using this, and I think either 2 or 3 of those are governmental agencies that I'm not really allowed to talk more about. So I'm just going to skip right on past that. So there were a few pros and cons from us going from serial to named. And in the serialized world, having control over your app deployment is a lot better in serial, because you can package them up yourself. You can put them into whatever package manager you use, whether that's Monkey or D3. Anybody using D3 from the Pixar one? And you can scope that however you want and deploy it however you want. Named, you don't quite have that much control. Upgrades. Serial was a much better control over upgrades because you package them yourself, so you have control over when new versions of the Adobe apps go out into your environment. In Named, you don't really have that control. They don't let you block specific versions of apps. You can block the Apps tab in CCDA, but that doesn't really help you if you're doing the whole self-service thing. So yeah, upgrades, better in serial. Shared workstations. Obviously, this was way better in the serialized world because serial is just a machine-based license, and you install it on your machine, and it doesn't care who's signed in or how many users are signed in. It's a machine-based license. It just works. And in the named, you have to do a lot more stuff, like feature-restricted licensing I mentioned. But the user experience in the named world is better. So if you really go all in on that whole self-service thing, we feel like the named license world is better because as soon as there's an upgrade, users have access to it, for better or worse. Totally, some people don't like that. But the users love it, let me tell you. And the support burden, admittedly, is a lot lower in the named world. We're not in the packaging business anymore with Adobe stuff, which is a huge burden off of our plate. As anybody who has packaged all of the Adobe apps every fall can tell you, it's not fun, and it's a little bit tedious. And as far as home use goes, so in the serial world, you could do this home use program thing where you can set somebody up. Technically, in your ETLA with Adobe, you are allowed to use your serialized package for, let's say, Photoshop, and you could install it on a user's home machine, and you could have a one-to-one. Whatever they use at work, they can also have that at home, and you use the same serialized package, same serial number, and all that. Actually, correction, you don't use the same serialized package. You make a new one because probably you were using the Adobe Update Server, and you have that package that points to your Adobe, and then you don't want that at their user's home, so you have to make a new one. Anyway. In the named user world, every user gets 2 activations. So their Adobe ID can activate Photoshop on their work computer and their home computer, and they're all good to go. If they try and use it on a third computer, it'll just say, hey, you already have this activated on 2 computers. Do you want to deactivate those other ones? And you say, sure, and it deactivates those other ones, and when you go back, and you just reactivate it again. So it's way easier for users to move their licenses around and be able to use it both at home and at work. And that happens all the time for us. We get requests all the time from people who want to work from home. So this all doesn't really matter, because serial numbers are a thing of the past over the next few months, or if you are lucky enough to have a serial number that expires in 2021 over the next years. So all customers that are currently using serial numbers are going to have to migrate to named user licensing or shared device licensing sometime from now until whenever your serial numbers expire. If you want to use CC 2019, you're going to have to move to named or shared device licensing. If you have any current serial numbers, Adobe is not going to let you renew those. You're going to have to migrate. So there were sort of 5 big questions that we had going into this migration. And the first one was, how are we going to handle user management? So that's like getting users into Adobe's systems. And then also, what does the process look like for if an admin needs to assign an entitlement to a user? I know what Adobe would tell you right off the bat, which is that an admin logs into the CCDA and does all this manually. But we were like, that's not great. So we wanted to think about that. Second was, how are we going to convert all of our existing users from serial to named? How do we do this in a way that is mostly invisible to the user, but also give them the education and tell them this is what's different, this is how you use and deploy Adobe apps in this new world? How are users going to get access to new apps? So if a user has Photoshop, but they don't have Illustrator and they start needing Illustrator, what does that process look like from the request to it being granted and getting it deployed? What does that whole workflow look like? How are we going to handle app updates? So in the serialized world, we were mostly using Remote Update Manager, which I will talk about in a couple of slides. But what does this look like if we want to try and do this whole self-service thing and try and play ball with Adobe and do things sort of the way they want us to with the CCDA? There's updates in the CCDA, but there's also RUM. How is that handoff going to work? And finally, how can we just be smarter in general about distributing entitlements? A little bit of history for Adobe at Pixar. Forever, we were just willy-nilly about licenses. Anybody, a PA who just needs to crop a photo is like, oh, I need Photoshop for that. And we were like, yeah, sounds good. Let's do it. And we would just be giving away entitlements left and right with no sort of audit trail or checks and balances or anything like that. And so it's like, okay, how can we be a little bit smarter about this? So the answer, as any sysadmin will tell you, the answer to all of life's questions is automation. So let's go through these one by one and see sort of what we did. So user management, some of you will be familiar with this handy-dandy thing called the Adobe User Sync tool. Neil Martin has a really great presentation that he did that sort of explains in a lot more detail about the User Sync tool. But basically the way it works is that it's a daemon that runs on a server. For us, it's a Linux VM, but I think it'll run on anything that's running Python 2.7. And AAT is a tool that we use internally that I'll talk a little bit more about later. But basically, it serves as an intermediary between your enterprise directory and Adobe's servers. So we're an LDAP shop. We have a bunch of groups in LDAP that then the User Sync tool maps to equivalent groups in our admin console. And so whenever a user gets added to an LDAP group, that automatically triggers, and we get the user gets added to the group in the admin console, which triggers an entitlement for them. So all we have to do to give somebody entitlement is just add them to an LDAP group. And we can add somebody to an LDAP group in any number of ways, and it's highly automatable. So how do we convert existing serial installs to named license, and how do you do it in a way that sort of makes sense for the user? So the way we did that sort of looks like this, and you can see in green, this is sort of what's happening server side, and in blue, what's happening on the client's machine. So the first thing is we evaluate who are the active users of each app. We do that individually for each app. And so if we determine someone's an active user, we add them to the LDAP group. And then on the same time, we run a remove volume serial, which is a binary that Adobe will give you that just strips out serial information and strips out all licensing information if you were in the serial world. So then as they're added to LDAP, that triggers the user sync tool, which adds them to Adobe admin console groups, and that activates their entitlements. Meanwhile, we install the Creative Cloud desktop app. We do it with D3, our package manager. And then the user, once all this is done on the server side, they get an email saying, hey, you've just been migrated to named licensing. Here's instructions how to sign in to the Creative Cloud desktop app, which is already on your computer. So updates. It's a little bit of a weird one, and we wanted to we still wanted to use Remote Update Manager, which many of you are familiar with. It's basically Adobe's command line tool to run Adobe updates. And when it works, it's great. It's simple, and it does what it's supposed to. It comes with a couple caveats, though. You can't do major revisions with Remote Update Manager. You can only do dot releases. So I can't upgrade from Photoshop CC 2018 to 2019. I can only do a dot release. And RUM will fail if certain conditions aren't met. That's basically a nice way of saying that RUM kind of fails a lot. RUM will fail if there is an Adobe app open, if you have a pending reboot, or if the user wore a yellow shirt that day, or if you're in a waxing moon phase. It's a little finicky. So we wanted to, since the Creative Cloud desktop app is a lot better and more reliable at doing updates, but it's not programmable, we wanted to sort of use a little bit of both. And so we did this thing called update nagging. So if RUM fails 5 times, we keep track of all those failures, and we show the user a pop-up that says, hey, there are Adobe updates available to you. We don't tell them that RUM has failed 5 times, because that doesn't mean anything to a user. But then that just means, let's try and point this user to the Creative Cloud desktop app so that they can run these updates that RUM is obviously not getting. And if the user ignores, because users, I'm sure as you all know, users like to just say no, no, later, ignore. If that happens, if they ignore this 3 times, we're automatically going to submit a help desk ticket on their behalf. And an admin will follow up with them and say, hey, what's the deal? We're trying to get some Adobe apps going. OK, so I don't know what your guys' users are like with Adobe apps, but our users are pretty voracious with Adobe apps. And it looks pretty much like this. So they want the new stuff, and they want it quickly, and they all want more apps than they really need. So one of the big questions is like, OK, how can we be a little bit smarter about, not everybody needs Photoshop. Not everybody needs Illustrator. In fact, very few people really need Illustrator. So how can we just be smarter about distributing these? Because these kind of tend to add up, especially after you migrate in the named user world. So the first way we do that is with something called gatekeeping, which is basically just making sure that an admin audits every request. So I'll show you the self-service request workflow that we use for this, but basically users have to request an Adobe app, and they do so with Jamf self-service. An admin will review that, and it makes sure that if they find that the user doesn't really need what they're asking for, they'll have a conversation and be like, oh, if you just need to crop a photo, you don't really need Photoshop. You have all these other tools that are already on your Mac that can do that. And the other way is with expirations. So basically, we're always capturing application usage data from Jamf. And if we sense that somebody has an entitlement to an Adobe app, but they haven't used that app for 30 days, we revoke that entitlement, and we do all that automatically, and we do it silently. Because if you take away a user's entitlement and you tell them, hey, just a heads up, you weren't using this app, so we took it away, what's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to go back and request it. Yep, exactly. They're going to call help desk, or they're going to just request it again. So if they don't use it for 30 days, we silently take it away, and more often than not, they don't use it again. So now we're not paying for that extra entitlement that's just sitting there unused indefinitely. And we don't even uninstall the app. We leave it there in case they need to request it again. We don't have to do the whole install thing again. It just activates their entitlement and just launches. So how do the users get access to Adobe apps? And for that, we have a little demo for you. Apologies in advance if this goes kind of fast. I'll talk through it, but if you want to see it again after, just let me know. OK. So let's say I'm a user, and I currently have access to Photoshop, but I don't have access to Illustrator. As you can see, it's just in trial mode. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to open up Jamf Self-Service. I'm going to go to Adobe Illustrator. I'm going to hit Request. So this triggers this request dialog. It says, hey, what do you need Illustrator for? OK, I need to actually edit some graphics, do some vector-based work. That's legit. OK. So Illustrator, we've just created a help desk ticket on behalf of the user. Now I'm the admin. You can tell it's an admin because it's in dark mode. And this is our work request system. And I take that work request number. That's all I need. I can plug that into this tool that we wrote called AAT. It stands for Adobe Approval Tool. And I can see, OK, they need to edit some graphics. That's legit. I'm going to go ahead and approve this request. Now this user has just been added to the LDAP group for Illustrator. That triggers an entitlement in the admin console. And it also sends an email to the user saying, hey, you've just been granted access to Illustrator. Here's how you install it. Go ahead and open the Creative Cloud desktop app. And there the user can see Illustrator is now available to install. So here's sort of what's happening under the hood throughout that process. Again, sort of in green, that's what's happening sort of with the user side or with the admin, just the actions that are happening. And then the interface is in blue, what's actually making that happen. So it starts with the self-service request, which is basically a Ruby script that's calling Cocoa dialog to get that user reasoning, and then Jamf helper to throw up that pop-up. That talks to our work request API. That's all internal, but every service desk or work request help desk system has an API, pretty much. And so then the admin is notified either via email or Slack. And so then they can see the request. They then use the AAT, which is a Ruby CLI tool, to approve the request. That talks to our Ruby LDAP module, then adds them to the LDAP group, which then triggers the user sync tool to add them to the admin console for that app. And then it notifies the user via email or Slack. So I want to talk really quick about named license packages because I haven't forgotten that those are a thing. If you moved a named license and you really, really want to still package everything yourself, you can do that. You can use named license packages, which are basically not very different from trial packages. They're just Adobe apps that don't have a license, and so you need to sign into them. And it includes the CCDA, but it disables the apps panel by default. But you can still deploy it the same way you're doing your serialized packages, and the user just signs in when they need to launch it. So the downside of that, and what we were trying to get away from, is OK, now we still have to do all this packaging. That's such a pain in the butt every year, twice a year, whenever. And users still have to wait on IT to get the new releases. And I know a lot of people like to have control, oh, I don't want to put the new version out there. And we thought about that. But we found that we won a lot more capital with our users giving them access to the new versions right away, more so than the loss of potential compatibility issues, which have been way better since I want to say CC 2014. Compatibility issues, especially in things like Photoshop, have been way better. And we actually find that it's not really that issue. We get very, very few help desk tickets about compatibility issues. So it's why don't we just give people access to the new stuff? And also just the whole concept of trying to move more into self-service and give the users more power to get these apps themselves, remove all of this administration overhead on our department. Because, and this is the way Adobe really wants us to do these things. So it's OK, let's try to do it the way they want to. And I know I just put this slide in a little bit because every time I did a version of this talk, the first question people always ask me is like, what about all apps? You guys do all these like one-to-one app group things. What about all apps? So the thing about all apps is that it's only worth it if a user is simultaneously using more than a certain number of Adobe apps. And I think that number probably depends on your agreement, but basically it would increase we could do that. With all of our automation, we could take that into account. It increases the complexity quite a bit, but we found that there weren't enough users that were simultaneously using enough Adobe apps to cross that threshold that all apps was really worth it. Especially when we're doing all of this automation around automatically removing things that haven't been used, all that gets cleaned up. It very rarely occurs that people really need all apps. So yeah, we did the maths. It wasn't worth it for us. So the final takeaways are the user sync tool is great, and you should absolutely use it. Use self-service. You can definitely tie in your own self-service things with what Adobe is doing. Use Remote Update Manager because it's great most of the time, but have a contingency plan. Gatekeeping and expiration are great for sort of automatically managing your entitlements and making sure that you're not using more than you need. And in the end, the sort of big takeaway for us is it's like, we're okay to give up a little bit of deployment control if it means that it saves us a lot of time and headache, both for us as admins and for our users. All right. That's all I got. Who's got questions? Oh, and also here's a QR code that goes to a bunch of resources. It gives you contact info for Neil Martin and Darren Wallace, and as well as links to their talks, as well as some other resources as well. I apologize. You're probably scanning the QR code on your phone, and the pictures for some reason are huge on the mobile browser. So, yeah, go ahead.
How do you license it? So do you license it for individual apps, or have you just done a blanket license for the whole bundle?
As far as we know, there isn't really such a thing as a site license anymore. So all of our apps are licensed individually. So every app, so Photoshop, Illustrator, and Design, they all have buckets. That's like, say you have 100 Photoshop licenses. We have a lot more than that, but.
At the moment, we have Photoshop licensed individually and all apps.
Right, and you could do that. And even with all of this automation, you could still do that. But like I was saying earlier, all apps, the only way all apps is worth it is if a user really needs more than a certain number of Adobe apps all the time. If they're only using one or two over a 2-week or month-long period or whatever you set for your expirations, then it's not really worth it.
Because obviously, what you've got on free apps, it's more expensive to do free apps individually than it is to do the whole apps.
Sure, yeah.
But you're putting
So he's doing questions now. Didn't catch that.
Yeah, and so our bucket is like, we have a bucket with this many number of Photoshop licenses. The expirations make it so that we're always under that bucket. Any other questions? Ben? Oh.
So historically, when you've been dealing with Adobe stuff, maybe in print houses, etc., keeping the versioning has always been very, very key, and you folks have kind of taken a step back from that. Have you found that? I mean, it seems to have been a non-event. Is that just kind of just with the modern iterative updates? Has it just been cool, or because it's quite a change, isn't it, from what we've done historically?
Yeah, totally. So I totally get the whole like, oh, we got to lock down versions. These people, and for a long time, Pixar was like, oh, these people that are working on Toy Story 3, they're locked into this Photoshop version. Everyone on this show is using that. Then we know everybody's compatible, and then everybody on this show is using a different version, and they're all working together, so they need to maintain compatibility. But we actually looked. We keep great records with our work request system. Our users know to use it, so pretty much all issues that we ever have go through that. We looked, and the amount of issues that we had with compatibility version to version went down dramatically over the course of a few years. starting with CS6, going up to CSC 2014. And I swear, compatibility is almost a non-issue for us these days. I don't know if we're doing some weird stuff. We've got some weird voodoo going on, but the whole, like, we need to lock certain areas of the company to certain versions is not an issue for us anymore. And totally, when this first came on our radar and Adobe told us, just so you know, you're going to have to migrate and here's all the things that you're going to have to do differently. One of our big questions was like, well, how do we make sure that we lock down versioning between different departments? And they were like, I don't know. And so we were like, okay, we're going to have to migrate. What are the things some of the things we're going to have to give up a little bit of control on? Like I mentioned, giving up a little bit of control. And one of them was versioning. But we looked into it, and it was like, it really was not that big of an issue anymore. And now that we've done this already, we kind of got ahead of this, and we did this last year, last spring, summer. And it's been pretty much a non-issue. And the other great thing about named user licensing and using the CCDA is that users can install legacy versions themselves. So they can say other versions in the desktop app and then install whatever version they need, if that ever comes up, which almost never does.
Are you InDesign users?
We are barely InDesign users. It's pretty limited, but I haven't found that there's been huge issues between versions with compatibility. Well, that might be because, well, for us, maybe it's not an issue because our users are very much, they want to be on the bleeding edge. And they're like, as soon as a new version is out, everybody wants it. And they want it as quickly as possible. And so people are pretty good about getting up to the same version. And fortunately, we only have so many InDesign users so that I think it's a pretty small knit community at the studio, and they all sort of stay. Bandwidth's not an issue for us. We're in the Bay Area.
Do you quite aggressively then keep your shared use machines up to date as well? Sorry. Do you find that you have to quite aggressively keep the shared use machines up to date? Are you using RUM for them?
Yeah, so we're still using RUM for them, but the shared machines all exist sort of in their own little vacuums. Occasionally, you get people who want to go into like a story room and they want to bring a Photoshop file that they were working on at their desk. But again, versioning between Photoshop versions and most other Adobe app versions has been a lot better. We do. There's not enough shared machines that burden is really terrible. It's basically the same as we were doing before, but there's a lot fewer of them. And so we are somewhat diligent about keeping those on the same version, but it's really not that much of a headache.
Thanks.
How are you handling authentication for Adobe IDs?
Yeah, so sorry, I don't really talk that much in this about the whole authentication part, but basically when you migrate to named user licensing, you're going to need to go through this process with Adobe where you set up a domain claim, where you claim your domain and set that up with Adobe, and then you do what's called a federated ID, which basically means sounds like you're familiar. And then, so we do everything through Okta. It's all single sign-on, it's two-factored, it's got all that. So as soon as a user gets activated, like a user that doesn't have any access to any Adobe apps doesn't exist in the admin console because they're not in any LDAP groups. But as soon as they get added to one LDAP group for one of these apps, they get triggered up into the admin console, which then just provisions an account for them in Adobe, and they're all automatically Okted up and ready for single sign-on, and they just go to the CCDA. As soon as they type in that first field, such and such username at pixar.com, it kicks them to Okta and it does a single sign-on.
What users have the ability to try apps, right? What do you do when they install all of those?
Trials, oh man, that was one of the big things we asked Adobe for is like, can we get rid of the trial versions? The language in your ETLA is a little gray about trial versions. And so we were basically told that it's okay if a user installs a trial app temporarily, but we sort of had to push the user education point and be like, if you, instead of just hitting a trial, just hit request. If you need it, we'll approve it. So a big part of this whole migration that I didn't really talk about in this talk is the user education point, which is like, this does involve a little bit of buy-in from the users, but it's good for them in the long run. So we did a big push with like educating our user base, especially the Adobe users, about what's changing, what does this mean for you, and sort of some guidelines about how to manage your Adobe apps. And it's actually very minimal on their end, but one of them is like, don't do trial version. If you need it, just request it, and we'll approve it in like 5 or 10 minutes. Cool. Any other questions? All right.
Come on, I'm desperate to throw this.
Oh.
Ready?
Okay, hi. So have you actually tried shared device licenses?
Nope.
No.
We do not get access to that at all.
Oh, right, because it's only education.
It's only education, and so I haven't gotten a chance to talk
Anybody
about that.
in here tried that?
Well, as I was saying, you should talk to Neil or Darren. I see him, he just popped in. So those guys have done a lot with shared device licensing.
Excellent.
And they both, if you scan this QR code, I have links to their talks that they did about it. And so you should definitely watch those and read up about it. I also have the Adobe links about shared device licensing
Perfect.
as well.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions?
With such rich content coming from your organisation, how do you pick the right GIFs for your slides? I mean, you must have so much that you can just choose around.
Oh, man. Ben, I have a really great story for you about my GIFs. Come see me after.
Okay.
For legal reasons, I can't talk about it, but I'll tell you after. The GIFs, the GIF choices were a long and arduous process. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me out on this side of the pond. It's been great meeting all of you. And yeah, if you have any follow-up questions or you just want to chat, feel free to grab me after. So thank you very much.